first I want to start off thanking the organizers, the staff, the volunteers, and you. You guys have put on one great conference. Unfortunately, the first time I was accepted, 2 days before the conference, I came down very sick. And so I had to present remotely, got plenty of feedback. So once again, is my mic on? Okay. So once again, thank you very much for coming. I'll just speak a little bit louder to make sure everyone can hear me. That being said, this talk is Zero to GRC Hero. I don't know why you guys would go through and subject yourself at 2 p.m. to a governance, risk, and compliance talk. Hey, but here we are. So who am I? I'm Micah K. Brown. I work for a financial organization, which if I had to go through and actually attribute the organization I work for, I'd actually have to go through and run these through legal. And these slides would be even more boring. I'm a member of the Cannon Fodder Sec board, a Queen City Con volunteer, and I speak at a lot of conferences, large and small. One of the crowning achievements, the very last conference I spoke at, GRCon, Grand Rapids, in the state I cannot say the name of, introduced me as an Ohio supremacist, and they're right. By the way, that is Ohio's moon. We claimed it first, we loved her first. So, what are we going to talk about? I'm going to give you a little bit of an organizational background for my organization so that you can understand the challenges that were thrust on me. We'll go over requirements of use cases of a data model that I am creating and I'm perfecting before I make it open source and public so that you can go through and take it, modify, and implement it. You know, oftentimes our small and medium businesses, they do not have the funds to get the proper GRC tools. I'm lucky. I work for a very large organization. I have something that is high and right on a certain quadrant that is magique. Many people, many organizations do not. And then we'll go over a deep dive into the data model that I'm put together, and I even found some errors that I need to go home and fix. So I'm going to do that, then upload this to my GitHub, which is github.com/Micah K. Brown. Didn't we just talk about GitHub just a little bit ago? So, organizational background. I work for a very large financial organization. We operate on all 8 continents, even the one I'm not allowed to talk about. That being said, we have 40,000 employees. That does not count partners, externals, contractors, or other entities that we allow to interact with our systems. We do reinsurance. So what we do is we purchase primary insurance companies and we sell them a special type of reinsurance policy. Basically, it caps their loss at a certain level, and if their losses over a season, over a year, exceed that, then my organization steps in. It's a way for us to reduce risk to an acceptable level. But when you do that, think about it. When we bring in a new company, we bring in old technology, old ways of thinking, old people, not necessarily, but people that are used to doing things in their old way. So every time we bring a new organization, we're bringing in a certain level of technical debt. And if you don't pay for that, it builds up and up and up until you get into a scenario that you eventually are going to have to pay it down. So, within a very large organization, you often have the 3 lines of defense model. So the first line is IT and IT security. Think of it as the hands on the keyboard doers. The second line, which we call IRM, they are the ones that define what our security policies and framework are. And the third line of defense is the auditors, who test if the first line is doing both what they say they're doing as well as what the second line says must be done. So, January 6th, 2021 was the worst day of my life, and not for the reason that you're thinking. It was on that auspicious day that my organization, the second line of defense, released a new security controls framework based on NIST CSF. Except they worked with a very large company, a consulting company, and they took the thing that is love and beauty of the NIST CSF, something that is openly attainable, and understandable to most IT and IT security professionals, and they customized it by adding an additional 950 requirements. If there's one thing and one thing alone that I want you to get out of this talk, is when it comes to your cybersecurity framework, your cybersecurity policy, do not roll your own. Trust the authoritative sources you're used to. If you allow one of those big consultant agencies to customize that framework, that policy for you, what you're doing is you're setting yourself a trap where you are going to be dependent on their consulting in order to make sure that you're meeting up to what they wrote. So one of the things that they delivered was a new norms framework. So when I say norms, you generally think guidelines, work instructions, and policy. So the second line is the only one that can write our policy, our framework, and that's approved by the board, telling IT and IT security what must be done. If I need to write a type of a norm, a document that must be followed, i.e. we call it binding, I can only write guidelines and work instruction. Everything else, if it's not a formal guideline or a work instruction, it is other or supporting documentation, and it's considered best practice and non-binding. Any questions here? Excellent. So on January 6th, I was out walking in Amelia. I got a call from my boss, Amelia, Ohio. And he's like, Micah, I need to speak with you. I'm like, sure, let me head on home. I'll be home in about 15 minutes. I logged on and he told me about this new framework, this new policy that they called the ISM guidelines that was becoming binding. It took the NIST CSF at that time 1.0, and we have a detect, an identify, a protect, a recover, and a respond section to that framework. And they customized it. What does that look like? It looks like this, where number 1 is the NIST category, number 2 is the NIST subcategory, word for word NIST. Then they went through and they created the control requirements as well as the bullet points are the control statement, and the bullet points are the control requirements. They also have this descriptor. It plays a real deal in the implementation, not so much for this talk. So the way that you want to think about this is a ISM category can have one and only one ISM subcategory. A subcategory can belong to only one NIST category. Likewise, an ISM subcategory can have one to many control statements. Each control statement can only belong to one subcategory. The control statements can have 0 to many control requirements, and the control requirements can have only one control statement. You following me with that basic logic? Great, we can move on. At the same time, we're paying down other types of technical debt. We're wanting to go through and we're wanting to hyper standardize. So one of those ways is in EA patterns. When you think of EA patterns, I want you to ask yourself a very profound question. What is a cheeseburger? If you had to write a pattern for what is a cheeseburger, you're going to have several building blocks. So one of those building blocks is going to be the patty. Is it going to be beef? Is it going to be Angus? Are you going to do a chicken patty? Is it going to be something else? You're going to have probably several building blocks for the cheese, other building blocks for other condiments, lettuce, pickle, onion, barbecue sauce, mustard. I wouldn't put that on mine. And then you're going to have some options for the bun. But the idea is each of those building blocks is going to have certain attributes about it. So let's take each attribute would have a caloric intake. So if you were to build a pattern for a cheeseburger out of a specific set of building blocks, you could measure the total caloric intake of each building block in that pattern, and you could go through and get the total caloric intake for your specific pattern for a cheeseburger. Any questions? At the same time, another group of my organization is working on a new control assessment tool. So as we go through the process to get a project implemented, they have to go through this new control self-assessment tool, which will basically go through and will help the actual project manager and project team answer how they meet each requirement outlined in the ISM guidelines, all 950 individual customized control requirements. Some of them are very bad. Any applicable rules, laws, regulations. So anything that I'm building with my mapping tool needs to be in alignment with this control assessment tool and should ultimately help them automate as much as possible this new control assessment tool. We already talked about the debt acquired in going through and acquiring companies, but there are other debts that we're going through. For example, this mapping took 3 years of my life. I had 8 consultants that reported to me. No one should report to me. I'm much better with computers than with people. But one thing became very interesting. We started arguing on a single control statement, the implementation and how it would change if we put the focus on a different word as we read it. So if you are doing a control mapping exercise, just be aware that it's going to go through and it's going to be very subjective. Also, it took us a good year and a half to go through and to review all of the existing guidelines, work instructions, and to go through and to work with the relevant owners of that documentation to do our initial assessment. A hard truth, because I'm a techie. I'm the help desk guy that got so bored that they went through and started to look at the server errors and fix the server errors one by one, that then got told, hey, we need you to go through and to learn networking, so I did my CCNA. Then I went a little bit crazy for 18 months and got 4 out of the 5 Cisco professional network or certifications at that time, passed the CCIE written, before I made it over into security. So I've always been technical. So I'm being asked to go into a discipline, GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance, which I have a high level understanding, but no practical hands-on experience. So that was challenging, and I understand that my technical folks, they would rather be doing technical things than doing stupid documentation, because I used to be that guy. There were certain control requirements that were put on us that were just not technically possible. You see, our second line, they're very good people. They intend well. It's just oftentimes they have not been hands on the keyboard IT or IT security people. And so I pulled out 10 of the worst control requirements that they put on IT, and I was on a meeting with the head of IRM, and I was reviewing each of those 10 findings. 2 of my favorite ones is data in transit must be protected by data masking. And I asked them, I told them, that's not possible. They, yes, it is. I was like, then please show me, well, it's documented in NIST. Please show me the specific NIST article, because data masking is something that is either done at store through a filter or at view at the browser level or other UI interface. It's not something that is done in transit. The word that they wanted there was encryption, and they already had that covered in a different requirement. And then I was called flip it when I held up a humble USB device, and I said, this device does not have a CPU, it does not have a network connection. How can I possibly remotely wipe it? Once again, words have meanings, right? Another one of my favorite ones, and I didn't put that one on here, is if a user is expected to be away from their system for over 15 minutes, the user must log out of that system. It's like, you do understand the implications of that one, right? The log out and a screen lock are very different. I actually mathematically measured, I went through about 4 log out logins. I found that my average from hitting enter to having a system that was fully up and ready to work was somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes. You think the average person is going to be away from their desk at least for lunch and then at least one other time during their work session. The amount of impact you're going to have on the performance of the average worker, you probably want to go through and make sure that you run the policy through IT before you go through and you implement it. So now the boring part, the requirements and use cases. So we wanted to create a tool that could go through and could map those control requirements to the implementing teams and or service, the various map norms, the GRC questions, and that's from the self-assessment tool, the protection profile, which is a NIST 853 inspired requirement that we had, the EA patterns and building blocks, the threat catalogs, the sections of our software development lifecycle, the enterprise architecture documentation tool. So this tool, basically there's an entry for every compute unit, whether it be an application, an out-of-the-box type of appliance, or a specific piece of software. It all has an entry in this enterprise architectural document tool. The evidence to go through and to help you understand what you need to provide to an auditor to prove that you are meeting this requirement. So that's all of the internal things that we want to map to. The external things that we want to map to is our informational sources. So these are external authoritative sources. So it could be a vendor best practice, it could be a NIST document, it could be a SANS document. Then we wanted to go through, and since MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE DEFEND are modeled a little bit differently than most informational sources, we decided to have those be their own level. If you don't know about those, I strongly recommend you look at both. They're very good. And final, we deal business in a lot of countries, so we need to understand what rules, laws, and regulations are applicable to each of those control requirements, so we can understand if there's a change in a specific law, do we need to go back and take a look at our cybersecurity framework? So, a couple other requirements that we have. The tool must be able to identify gaps in both documentation and implementation. The tool must help update or help our update cycle. So my organization, I'm allowed to update guidelines and work instructions twice a year. I need to understand when these documents are updated, which of the control requirements do I need to review to make sure that we don't cause any new gaps? Likewise, when there's an update to this new cybersecurity framework, we call it the ISM guidelines, we need to understand which of the mappings to everything else do we need to review to make sure that we are in alignment with the new changes. The tool must be able to quickly identify how we meet existing control requirements and exactly what evidence is needed to prove. I spend a lot of my time saying, hey, to meet this requirement, what do I have to do? Wouldn't it be nice if I could just go through and have a tool that is user-friendly, that a user can click through and self-feed, and then if they have any questions, sure, then come to me, but I don't want to be a human flesh bag version of ChatGPT. It happens too often. It's one of the most common tasks I do in a day, and that's sad. The tools should have an automatic workflow and get the needed approvals when there is a change to any mapping to ensure that we have a inventory that is and a tool that is up to date. So now we're going to get into the fun part, the actual design. And while I was in college, I had to take 3 database courses. So I'm fairly decent at data modeling, and yet I make mistakes. Now, what I did was I took all of the experience that I had doing my customized, and I made it more generic. The goal of this talk and this project that I'm working on is to give a data model, because I'm not an application designer. That's where I'm my weakest in my organization or in my IT security. It doesn't mean I can't do it. I just have to spend a lot of more time doing it than other areas where I have more competencies in. So I wanted to give something that those small, medium businesses that can't afford something that is high and right on a quadrant that is magic, so that they could have a tool that would help them be a little bit more flexible. And here's the general outline of this tool. I'm going to warn you, I found a logical flaw, and I'll show it where it is. So I need to go through, re-up load this. Unfortunately, do you know that Macs can't run Visio in this day and age? What's up with that? So, you can see that we've got a lot of tables and a lot of relationships, right? And I know this slide is very busy. The only thing that I need you to see is there is that one box that is green right there. Everything flows through that one box. And that was, if you remember when we were talking about the structure of our framework, that was the bullet points. That was the control requirements. So we're going to step through this a little bit one by one. So, as you can see here, the first thing I want you to understand is, you see the purple text there that ends in PK. So that is going to be the primary key for each table. They're going to be bolded with FK at the end. That stands for foreign keys. So they're primary keys from other tables that I brought into this table, and that allows a relational database to do the mapping. Now, this isn't a perfect data model, but this is something that works for me because I'm not a database guy, but I play one at work. So when we take a look, you can see there's two sets of numbers. The one to many that's closest to the ISM category says the ISM category can have one to many subcategory, but the subcategory can only belong to one category. Likewise, the same logic for the subcategory, same logic for the control statement. The control statement to the requirements is a little bit different in that the control statement can have 0 to many control requirements, but each control requirement can belong to only one statement. So to make the mapping between the category and the subcategory, you can see on the category, I added the subcategory's primary key as a foreign key, and then on the subcategory, I added the category's primary key as a foreign key. Do you follow that logic? Because we're going to see a lot of repetition here. So the next thing that we wanted to do was something simple, mapping the teams to the service. The logic here is the control requirement can go through and be fulfilled by 0 to many teams and services. The 0 there is because we did have some gaps. We expected that we'd have some gaps. And a team and or service could be responsible to meeting 0 to many control requirements. So the way that I did this was I created that middle linking table. You can see that I pulled each primary key into that. Now, this is a key decision that you need to make as part of your data model, because you could, if you wanted, just have the primary key be the combination of those two foreign keys, or you can do what I did, which is I have an individual unique primary key. In many cases, I would just make that an incremental number. I would definitely recommend an incremental number in this strategy if you were going to add additional attributes to that linking table. Follow me? All right, we are using the same logic to go through and to knit together the norms document. So that would be our binding guidelines and work instructions to the applicable control requirements. The only thing that I did different is between the norms document and the norms owner. The logic is the norms document can have one and only one primary owner in my organization and one secondary control owner. So all I do in that case is I bring the primary key over, or from the norms owner, twice under the norms document. Once as a primary, once as a secondary. Pretty simple, and you're going to see this logic replicate. Now, the protection profile is something unique to NIST 853. So in my environment, we go through and we classify our systems by a CIA score. So we rate each attribute C, I, and A from 1 to 4. You sum it together, and that's your CIA score. So we have a CIA ultimate or a protection profile of low, medium, high, ultra high. So it ends up into 4 buckets. So this is where I actually have a logical fallacy. I'm sorry, I should be flogged and humiliated, but I'm going to fix it. So the first part is pretty simple. Going through and modeling NIST 853 as its own table with the logic that a control requirement can have 0 to many different requirements in NIST 180 or NIST 853 R5, and a single requirement in NIST 853 R5 can be met by 0 to many control requirements. The error is I should have put an intermediate linking table in between the NIST 853 R5 and the protection level. I apologize. I'm going to get that fixed, and I'm going to put it out on my GitHub as soon as I get home. Now, we get to the part of EA patterns and building blocks. So the way I view it is the actual attributes that we're measuring is not really at the pattern, because everything that we're measuring in terms of the mapping, the pattern is the sum of all of the building blocks it's using. That's why I have the link between the control requirements and the building blocks using that same linking style table. And then again, we have that same logic that a building block can belong to 0 to many patterns, and a pattern is made up of 0 to many building blocks. And by doing that, ultimately, what I should be able to do is once we build out our patterns, I should be able to say Windows 2016 R2 should be able to click that, and I should be able to say, based on that specific patterns, here's everything that is covered by default because you used the patterns. The idea that we want to get to is we want to be able to order our systems just like you do in the cloud. We want to go through and use hyper automation to first submit the request, get the approvals. Once all the approvals are done within the organization, that system is built out wherever it lies, whether it's a cloud, whether it's an on-prem. So this is really going to be a time savings for us, but we need to be able to proactively be able to defend. This is what's taken care of because you're using the pattern, and this is what's left over for the system owner to go through and to take care of. Now we're going to talk a little bit about mapping to various external resources. Well, some internal, some external. So we wanted to be able to map to our threat catalog. So once again, very similar logic. A certain control requirement could belong to 0 to many threats in a threat catalog, and a threat catalog could apply to 0 to many control requirements. So once again, just that simple linking table. The same is true for MITRE ATT&CK and MITRE DEFEND. You can take a look at if you wanted to add additional notes in the linking table, then you're definitely going to want to keep that primary key as an auto incrementing number or some other type of value, not just the 2 foreign keys. And that's the primary reason why I just kept with the incrementing integer there. Next, remember our informative sources. These are just external documents. They could be vendor best practices, they could be NIST, they could be ISO, they could be anything that you want to go through and say, this document has some value. So once again, it's a 0 to many from the control requirement to the informative sources, and a 0 to many from the informative sources to the control requirements. Here you'll see I actually put a mapped chapter attribute so that you can go through and you can, instead of saying, here, Mr. IT or security person, read this 900-page document. You can at least get them down to the chapter level. You can even go further with more attributes if you need to, or you could do like 9.5. Really, this is meant to be taken by you and to be modified so that's useful for your org. The same logic is true for mapping between the control requirements, our software development lifecycle, as well as our control requirements in our EA documentation tool. So you can see I've included the map chapters there, so you definitely want to go through and keep the primary key as not just the 2 foreign keys. We're getting to the end of this slowly but surely, I promise you. Likewise, evidence. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to hyper automate how we go through and perform audits. We operate in a lot of countries and we have a lot of different auditors. So when it comes to cryptography, I want my people to know in order to prove cryptography at or in transit, you need to provide the cipher suite and the key length details. You don't want to provide anything more. You definitely don't want to provide the public and private key to prove that you're encrypting the documents, right? That would kind of go through and negate the reason for encryption. So we want to be very prescriptive so that we're giving just enough to make sure that we can defend our environment. And as much as possible, we want to go through and automate the collection. In order to do that, we need to communicate what do we need to collect automatically. Likewise, the legal, this one is, the same logic, from control requirement, 0 to many to legal. So that's rules, laws, regulations, contractual obligations, and a 0 to many in the reverse way, which makes it pretty simple. The GRC tool question. So within our GRC tool question, even though a lot of the time they're asking about the actual cyber framework, the specific question, they reworded it as a question, which added even more confusion. So we need to be able to go through and make it easy for, if someone says, hey, I've got this question, what are the requirements? This is going to allow us to go through, and based on that specific question, they'll be able to select it, and then it'll populate the who, what, why, when, where, everything that they need to know to fulfill whatever obligation they're looking for. And then the gaps is pretty simple. We needed a way to first define, track, and ultimately close the various gaps in our environment. And for this, we just did a simple one-to-one, that each control requirement is only going to have one block of text that is going to define the entirety of the gap for that control requirement. So it's just a simple one-to-one. So all I had to do was take the primary key from gap and put it in the control requirement as a foreign key. Implementation. Remember, I'm not an app dev, but I can share with you some horror stories. If you're going to build out this complex type of mapping, you could choose to do it in Excel. I wouldn't recommend it unless it's going to be transitory. You could go through and do it as an Access database, but it's going to be read-only for one person. Now, Access database is easy, it's lightweight, it's something that I had on my laptop, so I was able to spin up a proof of concept with only a few glasses of bourbon to do a proof of concept for my boss. Another advantage of doing it in Access is you can then relatively easily import it into Microsoft SQL. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. For the love of Pete Rose, please do not put it in a SharePoint list. There are nightmares. You can use a markdown language and a tool such as Obsidian. And if you've ever played with Obsidian, it's just a markdown language interpreter. It can do some really cool auto graphics where you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can pivot, you can do a lot of stuff. But personally, if I were going to do it, I'd use a generic relational database. That's what works best for me. But remember, you get to take and implement, if you choose to, in whatever tool you want. The ultimate best place that if you had it would be to use a GRC tool, right? Except the GRC tool is run by this team and they don't want IT and they're going through and mucking it up even though they wanted to customize a perfectly good framework. And there can be other implementations. Now, we're doing a pretty good on time. This is something I wish I knew years ago. I just stumbled upon this myself about 3 months ago. And it is a thing of beauty, it is a thing of glory, and it's the Cyber Controls Framework. So this is created by a bunch of GRC experts, and what they've done is they've defined IT and IT security into these, I think it was 33, 35 different controls. They then went through and mapped all of these controls to over 240 different authoritative sources. So rules, laws, regulations, contractual agreements. And what it does is, since I've gotten this, it's made my life so simple. When somebody asks me, hey Micah, how do we do X in Dora? How do we do Y in Vite? I can simply go to this framework, and I'm going to bring it up here in just a moment, and I don't care necessarily which controls they use, although this is a really good list of controls that you should evaluate how you're doing in each one for your organization. But if it says for a specific control under authoritative source A has a complementary in B, then I know that those two should be relatively linked. Now, it's not 100% perfect, but it gets me in the ballpark, and it has saved me so much time and space. So with that, we'll end that. Come on, there we go. Close here. So this is a copy I just downloaded. So it starts out with the actual security controls that they have here. These are their authoritative sources, and you'll notice that they're all color-coded, so they link like to like. And if I keep scrolling down, right here is 253 of these suckers. Here's where the magic happens. There we go. So here are all of the different. So this red stuff is stuff that they created as part of their framework. But then, as we go to the right, any of you use the CCMI scoring system? It has those already defined out for you, which is great. But then more specifically, you can start to see over here, right here is the CISC. Let me bring this down. Sorry, the CSC version 8. If we go a little bit, right here is our COBIT controls. We go over a little bit more, we're going to start to get into our ISOs. A little bit further over, you're going to get NIST. But you can see already how incredibly powerful this is, because if you go through their authoritative sources and you only say, I care about these 5 authoritative sources, and you hide everything else, you have yourself a pretty powerful mapping tool for free. Then it has even more. It has objective assessment, which are mapped in that primary tab. So it spells out in detail, here's what you should do for that. It has their view of here's what evidence meets those controls. This is a GRC platform in a box. Right here is their privacy framework, much as the magic SCF tab, but this is only for privacy. They have a risk catalog in a box for you. Great stuff here if you don't have anything. They have a threat catalog in a box for you if you don't have anything yet. And honestly, this list tab, there wasn't that much there the last time I looked at it. So my recommendation for you is go out, download this free spreadsheet, find which of the authoritative sources you care about, and then hide the rest. And this is going to go through, and you can use this to say, okay, we're good in these, we're strong in these areas, we're medium in these areas, we're weak in these areas, and then you can use that to go through and to advise and to advocate to yourselves, to your bosses, to your management. Here's where the best return on investment for our organization can go through and can be spent. So let me escape that. So with that, I am at an end. Unfortunately, I need to go home and make some edits to my data model. I'm going to plan to have that up within, it'll be by Monday on my GitHub, just github.com/Micah K. Brown. I'm sorry you had to sit through a GRC talk. Any questions? So, true story, I try to meet life through laughter with a smile. And how many of you like bourbon? Have any of you heard of Weller Antique, the red label? It's very good, very desirable, especially in Ohio. Very hard to get. I have a bottle of Weller Antique that I acquired over 3 years ago, and I put a real cheap ripped up paper, and I put policy mapping juice in a big Sharpie, and I stuck it over the Weller label. You can still tell it's Weller red, but there's, policy mapping juice on the desk. So every meeting I've been on since I've been put on this project, there's been a bottle of Weller red. The deal is, if my boss ever sees that bottle is open, he knows to send help. So I know we're wrapping up here. Matt, you've been a wonderful friend. We knew each other in the Cincinnati area, but it wasn't until a very small IT security conference, just like this one, in Louisville called DerbyCon. And on Saturday, my very first DerbyCon, DerbyCon 7, I came to it late in my IT security career. I saw Matt exiting the hotel, and I'm not sure whether I asked, hey, do you want to go grab lunch? Or you asked, hey, do you want to go grab lunch? But we went to go grab lunch. We wanted to go to the Smash Burger, but the Smash Burger wasn't open, so we went to the Chipotle. And that conference meant a lot. Not only did I get some great friends, but it was the first time that I felt like I belonged in IT security. I always felt like I was the IT guy wearing a fake IT security hat. And part of DerbyCon inspired me to want to go through and to speak and attend conferences just like yours here. Very great conference, very welcoming, very friendly. And Matt was my mentor in helping me go through and land my first speaking talks. Speaking at conferences really has given me a lot back. I've had some of the very coolest experience of my lives, have gone to some very great places. Matt and I, we've spoken at the highest of high. And I'm going to tell you something. The quality of talks that you have right here, right now, are the quality that you get at Black Hat, are the quality that you get at DEF CON. Personally, I like these smaller conferences because people are more approachable. I can tell you this, if it's your first time at DEF CON, it can be really overwhelming with 40,000 people. And so, I want to challenge you. The more I have given back to the security community, the more I've received. If you would have told me, 7 years ago that I would be friends with the guy that wrote the Metasploit book, Dave Kennedy, I wouldn't have believed you, but he saw me up at GRCon and he gave me a hug. I even had these anti-hug defenses in place and he violated it. I kid. But I've met so many of the coolest friends just because I've been willing to get up in front of my peers and to dance for 45 minutes. And I've never had any negative comments, any negative reactions. So if you are interested, please seek out someone that you've seen speak here. We want to help. I know I do a lot of mentoring. There's been several times where I've gone through and I've worked with someone. Heck, I've even gone through and done tag team speeches. So if you're a little bit anxious, find somebody with a little bit of experience that'll get on stage with you. Because when I did that with my good friend Alyssa, I went through, I knew if she screwed up, then I could just step on in and no one would know that there was anything different. I mean, I don't always hit every note I want to, but that's because I'm a much more improvisational speaker and I'm speaking from my mind. I know what I want to say. Sometimes I just have a little bit of a hard time getting it out. But with that, please feel free to approach us. We want to help. Thank you for having me and have a great rest of your weekend.